scientists tell us that there was a nothing. So what gave spark to that something? So from a scientist's perspective, the onus is on him now to show us that God doesn't exist. Because it stands to reason that if you take into account the watchmaker's argument that something must have come out of nothing, but there might have been a spark that led to that nothing coming out to something. What cause? What was the cause? And that cause takes us now to the existence or to the belief in the existence of God. That's on one argument. And we've got programs on that. In fact, if you can give us your name and address, there was a discussion which was held in Cape Town last year by Shabir Ali, where he did an entire lecture on this called "Does God Exist? An Answer to Atheism in a Godless Society." In fact, there are many people in the world today that are challenging this common idea. One of the main proponents in the world today is an apologist by the name of William Lane Craig, a Christian apologist, who basically gives you arguments in favor for the existence of God. From the Quranic point of view, there's more than ample argument that God exists. For example, it reasons with you and says, how can you not then believe? How can you not then believe, seeing that you were made out of nothing and He brought you into being, and He will cause you to die, and from that He will raise you back to life again? How can you not believe? Further, you'd find, for example, in the Qur'an, references and passages to modern day phenomena. For example, the example I gave you from Inception, which is categorized, and maybe I'll give you a copy for your question, brother. I want to present you with a copy of this Quran here. This is yours. You can have this for your particular interest. This is yours. You'd open up and you'd see references and passages to normal and natural phenomena. For example, and I'll give you just two examples and you tell me, how does this come into being? You see, and I'll give you a quotation from here. Before we pose God's question, right, to the atheist, men of science have studied astronomy and they studied the universe with a mighty telescope. And the man of science, though lacking in spiritual insight, he will tell you, and he will basically say, how does the earth exist? How did it develop? How was it created? And then he will respond and say, billions of years ago, the universe was a single piece of matter, and there was a Big Bang. And then out of the Big Bang, our solar system came into being, and since there was no resistance in that space to the primordial momentum that generated the explosion, stars were created, planets were created, and they all swim along in their particular orbits. All of it swims along in its orbits. A person in the desert living 1400 years ago, would he be aware of the fact that the planets would swim around their specific orbits? In fact, people believed that the earth, the sun and the planets moved around the earth, as opposed to the earth and the planets rotating in their own orbits and moving around the sun. Would an unlettered Arab living 1400 years ago in the desert know that? Of course not. So look at this verse in the Quran, in Surah Yasin, chapter 36, verses 38 to 40. It says here, and the sun runs its course for a period determined for him. That is the decree of the orbit. Then it says, it is not permitted for the sun to overtake the moon, nor can the night outstrip the day. Each, and it uses a word here, وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكِ يَسْبَحُونَ. Each just swims along in its own orbit. Now how could a person 1400 years ago know in the desert that the planets rotate in their own particular orbit? Unless, of course, it was divine will, divine plan. God dictates it to him. Or, for example, the Big Bang. Would an unlettered Arab 1400 years in the desert know that? Of course not. So how do you explain this verse? Do not the unbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together as one unit of creation before we clove them asunder? We created a Big Bang. So how will people know this? How do they explain this? So that tells us that in a sense, it was God who was revealing this to the person 1400 years ago. That's just one example. Then of course you've got modern phenomena, things like embryology. Some years ago in the university in Canada, there was a professor called Keith Moore. He wrote a book called The Developing Human. Today it's used as a standard textbook of embryology in most of the major universities around the world. But in the introduction of this book called The Developing Human, he's got a chapter called Islamic Editions. And what he did was, he looked at a particular verse of the Qur'an, Surah Alaq, where the actual creation stage is described as alaqa. Alaqa can be translated as the human embryo before its formation as being a leech-like clot, So what he did was he took this kind of paper plastic plasterine and he bit into it with his teeth and he created somites. And what he did was that he looked at a picture of a leech and he looked at a picture of the embryo in its most original, earliest stage, and he was remarkably shocked by the discovery of the Qur'an, having described it in almost its identical details, leech-like clot, partly formed and partly unformed. So how could an Arab in the desert have that kind of understanding? Would he have a microscope to be able to determine that this was how an embryo looked? Whereas only modern discoveries in modern day science, modern high-layered microscopic technology can tell you how an embryo looked. Here you find a description of the embryo like a leech-like clot. Something unheard of, unknown of, which people wouldn't understand, the alaqa. So this basically gives you the reality that there is a God that basically exists. Coming to your second part of your issue about God creating us in the image, doesn't mean we look like God. It basically means that we all created in the spiritual image of God, all of us. All of us here are created in the spiritual image of God. Otherwise, if we are literally in the image of God, that means if he is like a man, he would basically have an arm, he would have hands, he would have face, he would have legs, he would have skin, and of course if he's wearing pants, he might have something in his zipper as well. That's not God. So we can't basically believe that God is created literally in our image, he's created in our spiritual image. Spiritually we are created in the image of God, not in the physical image. There can only be one God. Christians and Muslims and Jews and even Hindus, because Hindus themselves in their own scriptures, it tells them there is only one God. The Prakti shall have no material representation. Only one God. But people develop ideas, they come up with accretions, they come up with their ideas and their own conceptions, and so the pure concept of God is subsequently, it undergoes a process of metamorphosis, and something which was pure and original and untainted becomes tainted. Does that answer the question? I think at the end when we leave programs of this nature, those who attend, go back to your homes, go back to your books, go back to the materials and spiritually contemplate in terms of where we want to find ourselves in society and where we want to find ourselves in eternity, in the hereafter. Many of us simply have a process of going to the churches, going to the synagogues, going to the temples, going to the masjids, going back home, doing our day-to-day affairs, and this constant rigmarole continues again and again and again and again. From the Muslim perspective, there's another side to it, that when you look again at concepts like ibadah, which means worship, our understanding of worship doesn't simply mean ritualistic worship. What, for example, would happen from the time someone leaves the house and he goes to the masjid and he sees himself in a community which is faced with pollution, in a community which is faced with poverty, in a community which is faced with HIV/AIDS, in a community which is faced with drug abuse, in a community which is faced with hunger, in a community which is faced with disbelief, and he does simply nothing about that. Because part of the spiritual quest in Islam, and I'm not speaking for Christianity, but I'm just saying particularly for Islam, part of the spiritual quest in Islam is to concern yourself with regards to the environment. Therefore someone said or remarked that even the term Islam could be an acronym for I shall love all mankind, or I shall serve all mankind. Because true service of humanity is actually service to God. You serve humanity and you serve God. That's our particular role in this particular world, and indeed in the hereafter when we face God and we ask Him and He asks us, my servant I was hungry and you never fed me. And the individual would ask God, well, how are you hungry? You are in no need of hunger. So God will say, well, look, my servant of mine was hungry, and when he was in need of food, you never fed him. I was thirsty, and you would ask God, well, how can you thirst? And he would say, look, my servant was thirsty, and you never helped him. In the Hadith Qudsi, you'd read that particular parable. So that's what Islam is. It stands for service to humanity. It stands for upliftment. It stands for moral rejuvenation. It stands for spiritual rejuvenation. And I would appeal to the Christians here that if you need any kind of assistance, if you need any kind of help in your community, go to the Muslim organizations, go to the Muslims in your community here and seek assistance from them, because they've got a moral obligation and an incentive which the Qur'an imposes upon them to help those around them and also create this spiritual assistance to humanity in terms of showing righteous belief. We don't say that you are unbelievers. You see, an unbeliever is someone who simply rejects faith when true faith is showed to hope towards him. That's a rejecter of faith. A rejecter of faith is an unbeliever. All of us here are believers. It's just possible that some of our beliefs may have perhaps steered to a different direction, or perhaps may be incorrect in certain aspects of philosophy or certain aspects of theology. Our duty, and certainly the Quran's position, is to simply bring you back onto that particular way, onto that righteous belief, and hopefully we will live together. We can debate and argue till the cows come home, but at the end of the day all of us will be facing our Creator, and we will be accountable individually towards Him in terms of how we lived our lives on this earth. So with that, I'd like to thank you. Thank you for coming. We will be in the Phoenix area soon, and indeed in the Chatsworth area. I believe the next time we're here we would be discussing the role of the 2010 World Cup. What's our response to Christians as Muslims? Is it an event that we should support? I love football. Or is it an event that basically is taking away the lifestyles and the livelihoods of thousands of people in our society? We'll debate and we'll unpack, and of course we'll deal with that. Thank you for coming. There are meals in the end. There's literature that's basically available. If you want to discuss with me, I'm free, open to discussion. You want to have further engagements with us, please leave your contact details. You can leave it with Muhammad or Iqbal or any of us. Jazakallah, thank you very much, and God bless you.